So if you can't keep what you earn or own what you build, you're not free. You are just renting your life from the state, from our government. You know, the founders understood this better than anyone alive today because they lived under a crown that treated their property as the king's to seize at will.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. We bled in the field.
So welcome back to the Modern Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, John Tig Tigan. Today, I'm going to talk about the backbone of liberty, property, and taxes. So we know the founders knew freedom wasn't just about words on parchment. You know, if you can't own what you earn or keep what you build, you're not free. That is why they tied property, taxes, and representation together at the very birth of our nation. So in this episode, I'm going to dig into three things: how property was seen as a God-given right, how unfair taxes lit the fuse to the revolution, and how modern abuse from eminent domain to the IRS are stealing our independence today. So then I'm going to give you the Patriot skill set for the week and give you a way to kind of somewhat fight back in your own community, and then Tig's tip at the end, kind of give you a little bit more preparedness. So let's get into it. Property as a natural right. So intellectual backbone the founders leaned on. John Locke, the second trustee of government, 1689, Locke called property one of the three natural rights: life, liberty, and estate. So his logic was that a man's labor was his own. And when he mixed that labor with something in the world, it became his property. Not the government's, but the government existed to secure that right, not grant it. So William Blackstone, commentaries on the laws of England in 1765. So the most widely read legal authority in the colonies. I've never heard of it till now, but you know, he wrote that property was that sole, I'm going to mess this up, deposit domain, which one man claims and exercises over the external things of the world in total exclusion of the right of any other individual. So kind of put it this way, you know, what he meant is your ownership was absolute unless you consented to give it up. So unless you gave it up, it was always yours. So these weren't just abstract ideas. You know, they were law books, you know, on the shelves of the original colonial lawyers, preachers, you know, and they were, you know, all over the place. Jefferson, Adams, and Madison read them. Ordinary farmers and tradesmen heard them preach from the pulpit. Hello, preachers, wake the fuck up. The founders were, you know, words themselves: George Mason, Virginia Declaration of Rights, June 1776, all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Mason tied property directly to liberty and safety. John Adams from Massachusetts Constitution, 1780. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. So Adam placed property on the same footing as life and liberty. James Madison, 1792, his essay called Property: Government is instituted to protect property of every sort. This being the end of government, that alone is just a government which inherently secures to every man what is his own. So Madison defined property not only as land and possession, but also opinions and the free communication of them. To him, freedom of consensus and freedom of press were forms of property. So Thomas Jefferson, in his note on the state of Virginia in 1785, Jefferson warned that if property was not secure, liberty would fail. He argued that an independent farmer was the backbone of the republic because he owned the soil he worked and was beholden to no master. So on the ground in early America, voting rights, in most colonies in early state, suffrage was tied to property ownership. Why? Because ownership meant independence. A man who owned and wasn't dependent on a landlord, employer, or patron to tell him how to vote, that was the founders' check against corruption and manipulation. So veterans were paid in land. After the revolution, many soldiers, they didn't receive money. They received land grants instead of the cash, because back then a lot of the states and our government was poor, but it knew land would make veterans independent citizens. So land was liberty in practice, not in theory. Northwest Ordinance 1787, when Congress organized the Northwest Territory, it guaranteed property rights and banned feudal titles. So the founders wanted every new state built on a base of free citizens, so ones who could own land outright, not serf bound to a lord or king. So contrast with Britain, colonies had seen how the crown used property as a tool of control. Through the writs of assistance, officials could search homes at will, through soldiers, quartering, forced in private housing, private property, through confiscation, estates of dissenters could be seized. So the revolution was in large part defense of property rights. So the founders' mindset for America, they knew that no man can be politically free if he's economically dependent. What are we seeing now? The government, everybody's dependent on the damn government right now. But, Jefferson wrote that, dependence begets Chris, why can't I say this word? I said it a minute ago. Subservience and oh my goodness. I'm about to redo this. I'm not going to. So pretty much made you slaves to the state. That's really what's going on even right now. So, it doesn't, the government being able to take our land when they want, it's making us, again, servants to them. So in plain terms, if you don't own property, is what they're saying, you're easy to control. So property was more than wealth. It was the ground of consensus, labor, speech, and even religion. Madison said a man has property in his religious opinions. So in the safety of his person and in the free use of his facilities. So that meant government treats the consensus or speech were also property violations. So the founders deliberately rejected feudal systems where a monarch or atrocity technically owned the land and people only held it by grace. So in America, ownership was supposed to be secure, transferable, and free from arbitrary seizure. So, for the founders, property wasn't an afterthought. It was the foundation stone of liberty. You take away a man's property and you take away his independence. So you strip that shield and the sword of government cut straight through it.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
So jumping right into segment 2, a little taxation and representation. Surprised I said that right. So the American Revolution didn't start with muskets. It started actually with taxes, but it wasn't about pennies on a tea or stamps. It was about the principle. Free men do not hand over their property to rulers who don't represent them. So the spark in the colonies, the Stamp Act of 1765, Britain forced colonies to buy a government stamp for legal documents, papers, and even playing cards. For the first time, the Parliament taxed the colonies directly. Not through trade. Colonists erupted. No taxation without representation. We see that nowadays. We don't do shit about it. Townshend Acts of 1767, more taxes on imported glasses, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Colonists boycotted British goods. John Dixon, letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, argued Parliament had no right to tax them for revenue. And then you had the Boston Tea Party, 1773, which everyone knows about. Over 300 chests of British tea were dumped into the harbor in defiance of that Tea Act, which gave East India Company a monopoly. But it wasn't about cheaper tea. It was about refusing Parliament's claim authority to tax without consent. And then you had the Coercive Act, so Intolerable Acts of 1774, when Britain cracked down, closing the Boston port, quartering soldiers in homes, and stripping Massachusetts of self-rule. And it took, property, liberty, and taxation were now inseparable in the colonists' minds. That woke them up. I don't know what's going to wake us the fuck up, but maybe something. But, the founders' response, Declaration of Independence, 1776. Going on 250 years now of this, but Jefferson listed as a grievance for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Seemed to do that a lot. So that was one of the clearest justifications for a revolution, Articles of Confederation, 1781. The national government had no power to levy direct taxes. States contribute voluntarily, weak in practice, but it showed how allergic the founders were to centralized tax power. Constitution, 1787, Congress was given power to tax, but with limits. Article 1, Section 9, banned on appropriation. Oh, my God. You guys must love this. Banned on apportionated direct tax. The system relied on tariffs and excise tax on goods like whiskey and stuff. So again, tariffs. Remember tariffs? The bad tariffs that Trump's putting on all these other nations? Anyways, so the federal government ran this way for over a century. That would be our U.S. government, by the way. There was no permanent income tax until 1913, when we started getting raped and molested and mutilated and all that fun stuff by our government. But, the founders never authorized it. It was a temporary income tax. Came during the Civil War, 1861 to 1872. The Supreme Court struck down another attempt in Pollock versus the Farmers Loan and Trust in 1895. So only with the 16th Amendment in 1913 was a permanent federal income rape tax allowed. The mindset, anyways. Patrick Henry, 1788, Virginia ratifying convention. The Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It's an instrument for the people to restrain the government. Least it come to dominate our lives and interests. Taxes were the front line of that struggle. The founders had lived under Britain abuse of taxation. They designed America so taxes would be tied to representation, consent, and limits. I don't know where all that went, but, the power of the purse was meant to stay with the people's representatives, not distant crown or bureaucrats. All these, anyways. So for them, taxation without consent was slavery. James Otis from 1764, taxation without representation is tyranny. On the ground in early America, Whiskey Rebellion from 1791 to 94, when Congress imposed a whiskey excess tax, the frontier farmers in Pennsylvania, they resisted violently. Washington marched troops to enforce it. This was the first test of federal taxation, and it showed even Americans, would fight back at taxes if they smelled tyranny. tariffs, they're the revenue. Through most of the 19th century, Democrats, let me repeat that, through the most of the 19th century, tariffs on imports funded 80 to 90% of our federal revenue. Citizens didn't file annual returns. The IRS didn't even exist. People kept their income. We got to keep our money. Government ran leaner and smaller. So local funding, through property tax. I hate property tax. States and towns relied on property tax to fund schools and local needs. I kind of get that. But, these were tied to visible nearby uses, not distant bureaucrats. So again, the revolution wasn't fought over the practice of stamps or tea. It was fought because the colonists refused to milk cows for rulers. They didn't elect. The founders built America on the idea that taxes come with consent and tight limits. The further we've drifted from that principle, people, the less free and the less free we've become. We're slaves to our government. Just think about that.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little
So, hope you thought about that. Gave you a few seconds. The rise of the income tax, the Civil War of 1861, to fund the war effort, the federal government instituted the first income tax. I kind of get that. We had to fight, but it was a flat rate of 3% on income over $800. That was about, $20,000 in today's dollars. The income tax was intended to be a temporary measure to finance the war, and that was it. But unfortunately, after the war ended, the tax, I guess not unfortunately, it was repealed, because I'm thinking about the taxes now, in 1872 as the government paid down its war debt. But 1894, in peacetime, Congress attempted to introduce a permanent income tax, but the Supreme Court said, no, go to hell, you can't do that, in Pollock versus Farmers Loan. The ruling that income tax were unconstitutional because they weren't appointed according to the population. So this case showed the difficulty of creating a national income tax. The system without facing a legal and constitutional challenges, which nothing seems to get challenged anymore. But 1913, the 16th Amendment, the passage of that finally resolved the issue, giving Congress the power to rape, molest us, steal our income, regardless of appointment. This was the shift. Laying the foundation for the modern system of income taxation. So world wars and the transformation of taxation. World War I, the Revenues Act of 1916 and 17. It expanded the reach of the income tax, initially targeting the wealthy, but eventually broadening to include more middle-class Americans. By 1918, millions of Americans were paying income taxes. World War II, the current Tax Payment Act of 1943, established the payroll raping withholding, fundamentally changing the way Americans interact, pretty much got raped by taxes. With this act, employers began withholding taxes directly from the employees. It's a system that ensured consistent revenue for the government. But before this, most Americans, they didn't pay income taxes directly. But after World War II, thanks to a Democrat, the withholding system became the norm of America. This move made the IRS a permanent raping fixture in the lives of American citizens. At the founders' mindset, back, 1774, James Otis, taxation without representation is tyranny. It echoed throughout the colonies and became the moral foundation of the revolution. Otis was one of the early figures to argue that being taxed by the government without representation was an infringement on the rights of everyone. Patrick Henry, in 1788, in his opposition to the proposed U.S. Constitution, Henry warned that without strict limits on federal power, the new government would be no better than the monarchy they had fought to escape. And I'm starting to agree. He feared that excessive taxation could become a tool of oppression. I know I'm feeling oppressed by this damn taxes, but for the founders, taxes were a means to provide for the common good, but were also seen as dangerous tools in the hands of a central government. They accepted taxations only when it was accompanied by representation, accountability, and transparency, principles they had fought for in the revolution against the damn British crown. The progressive taxation after World War II, the income tax system became more and more progressive with higher rates for, higher income brackets. This has been one of the main ways the government funds social programs, infrastructures, and a good thing, the military. The evolution of tax rates has played a significant role in shaping the social and economic policies of this country, and not for the damn good. I'm going to say it right now. The growth of the IRS, the modern IRS, which has started as a small office in the Treasury office, became more and more powerful, centralizing bureaucracy. Its growth paralleled the expansion of federal income tax and the rise of government spending programs and the raping of conservative organizations. So, there's 97 distinct types of taxes currently levied in the United States. So it's across the federal, state, and local government. So hopefully you don't mind me reading these out, but you have the income tax. So you got the federal income tax, on wages, tips, capital gains, dividends, and interest, etc. State income tax, local income tax, payroll tax, Social Security, Medicare, FICA, self-employment tax, capital gain tax, dividends and interest income tax. Then you have your property-based taxes, real property tax on land and buildings paid to local governments, personal property tax on cars, boats, business equipment, in some states, and property transfer tax. So when a property is bought and sold, you pay taxes. Estate tax, federal in some states, on inherited wealth. You got your gift tax, anything that's a large financial gift above IRS threshold, you got to pay taxes on it. Somebody gives you something, you got to pay for it. So sales and consumption tax, our general sales tax, state and local on goods and some services. So the use tax, this is a good one. Sorry. On out-of-state purchases where sales tax wasn't collected. Then the excise tax, specific goods, services, including gas, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, ammunition, airline tickets, cell phone service, indoor tanning, heavy trucks and trailers, tires, sugars for sweetened beverages in some cities. Another one, businesses and corporate taxes. So corporate income tax, federal and state. Gross receipt tax on revenues regardless of profit in some states. Franchise tax for the privilege of doing business in a state. Business license tax and fees. Commercial property tax, employment payroll tax, matching Social Security, Medicaid contributions, unemployment insurance tax. Here's another one. Vehicle and transportation tax, motor fuel tax, federal and state, vehicle registration fees, vehicle property tax in some states, tolls, technically it's a tax, driver's license fees, tire and battery disposal fees. Here's communication and technology tax, telecommunication tax on phones, internet, and cable service, FCC universal service tax, streaming services, digital advertising tax being implemented in some jurisdictions, health and wellness tax, health insurance premium tax, on certain employer health plans, the Cadillac tax delayed, others, other exist, tanning tax, 10% federal excise tax on indoor tanning, medical device tax was repealed in 2020, but previously taxed sales of medical devices. Travel, hospitality, and luxury taxes. I love this when I travel. Hotel and lodging tax, rental car tax, amusement tax on tickets for entertainment and sports, luxury goods on certain high-end items, cruise ship passenger fees, like head tax on ports, financial and investment tax, capital gain tax. I think I said that, but anyways, long-term, short-term investment income tax, dividend tax, financial transaction tax, local or proposed, rare, but still possible, bank account fees, sometimes taxed as service in some states, Miscellaneous tax and fees. A sin tax on behavior of the government wants to discourage alcohol, tobacco, sugary drinks. Plastic bag tax in some states. Actually, I think got banned in Colorado thanks to some 12-year-old girl because, we listen to kids. Carbon tax in some local jurisdictions that are embedded in the utility rates. So check your utility bill. Waste disposal and landfill fees, recycling fees, environmental impact fees, hazardous material fees, import and custom duties, tariffs on imported goods, fishing and hunting license fees, pet registration tax, court filing fees and fines, gun registration or permit fees, taxes hidden in prices or utility bills. So utility tax, gas, electric, water, sewer, energy surcharge, fuel surcharge, telecom surcharge, airport security fees, shipping and handling tax. That's not even all of them. So you are taxed in America when you earn money, spend money, own things, use things, transfer, give away, or inherit wealth, drive, work, live, or die. It's nearly impossible to go through a damn day without paying at least one tax. It's usually going to be several, but even if you're unaware of it. So America began as a nation funded largely by tariffs and excise without income tax or the IRS or paycheck withholdings. The system lasted for more than a century. It took world wars, constitutional amendments, and corrupt jackass politicians to legally transform taxations into a weapons system we know today. Maybe I should say a rape system we know to today. It's a system where most Americans see taxes deducted from our paychecks before we even touch our earnings. Our earnings. The founders, they had seen this system that would likely view it. If they had seen the system, they would likely view it as the very thing they fought against, taxation without true consent. Just think about that.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God.
All right, let's start this little segment 3 here, modern abuse, and maybe we can fight, a little bit of fighting back. The founders built guardrails against abusive taxation, and government seizure of property. 200 years later, those guardrails, I don't think they're just shattered. The same government that was supposed to protect our property is often the one stealing our property. Intimate domain abuse. The Fifth Amendment guarantees that private property cannot be taken by the government except for public use. I still don't even agree with that shit. And they're supposed to give you compensation. They decide what is the value of your property. But this was meant to protect property owners from arbitrary seizures. Reserving intimate domain for public goods like roads, schools, or public infrastructure, not just to come and take the house you freaking live in. But however, in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court screwed us and issued a controversial 4-5 ruling in I think this is the right one, in the Clio versus City of New London, which allowed the city of New London, Connecticut, to seize a home through eminent domain and transfer them to a private developer for a new commercial project. To a private developer, these people lost their homes. The court argued this would increase tax revenue. Thus, this is how they got justification for it. That would increase the tax revenue benefiting the public. Bullshit. This benefited that one douchebag. So this expanded, the interpretation of public use to include public purpose to a private fucking developer, leading to the legal precedents where property could be seized, not for direct public benefit, but for some douchebag for economic development, some project that might indirectly benefit the community, but it probably wouldn't. But following the ruling, many states passed laws to restrict the use of eminent domain for private development, which that was a good step. But again, the federal president, it still stands. It's still there, you know? So this has raised concerns that vulnerable property owners, particularly lower income families, could be displaced for financial gain for some private freaking douchebag. You know, it's sad. Property taxes, you know, do you really own your home? Do you really own your home when it's paid off? You don't. No, in the early days of the Republic, property taxes were low and tied to visible, tangible local benefits, you know, such as funding schools, roads, or police services. But today's property taxes are the largest source of state and local government revenue, making up almost 30% of total revenue across the country. So, you know, however, property taxes have a darker side. Even if you've long paid off your mortgage, failing to pay that property tax, you can still lose your freaking home. You know, the government can put a lien on your property and auction it off, keeping the proceeds to cover the back taxes. You know, that means in effect, you don't fully own your home. You never will. You are literally, we are renting it from the freaking state. It's bullshit. I saw this in 2023, not too long ago, people, the Supreme Court ruled in Taylor versus Hempton County that it's a county in Minnesota, had violated the constitutional rights of a 94-year-old woman. I'm not going to try to pronounce her first name. Her last name was Tyler, by seizing her condo over $15,000 in unpaid property tax. Get this, the county then sold the property for $40,000 and kept what was owed and pocketed the remaining $25,000. So the court ruled 9-0 that keeping the surplus, you know, was home equity theft, and that was unconstitutional. But to me, the whole fucking thing was unconstitutional. You know, but through the ruling, you know, it did help curb the most asinine abuse. The system still allows the government to seize your property over a freaking tax debt, potentially forcing individuals to lose everything if they miss a stupid fucking payment. The IRS, it's a raping weapon. You know, the IRS wasn't established. It was established in 1862 during the Civil War, you know, to collect property income tax. The agency was reorganized after the 16th Amendment in 1913, giving the federal government permanent raping authority to levy income tax. You know, the IRS, it grew in size and raping power during World War II with the introduction of the payroll withholding, you know, which automatically deducted income tax from employees. However, you know, over the years, IRS, you know, it has completely just had political bias and abuse of power. You know, before the Charlie Kirk thing just came out, and Turning Point USA and all the other 100 other conservative organizations, where they just did it to again. You know, the most notable incident was in 2013 when Lois Lerner, and the IRS official, admitted that the agency had targeted conservative and veteran organizations again, just like they did recently, applying for tax exempt status. You know, the group's applications were delayed, buried in red tape, or just outright denied for no reason, you know. But people fought back about the politicization of the agency. Investigations found that the IRS had been selectively targeting certain political groups for scrutiny. You know, again, it's a reminder of the dangers of an unchecked tax power, as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton warned. You know, when taxation power is not constrained, it can lead to the corruption and government overreach. You know, today, many see the IRS agency with unchecked authority all the damn time. They're vulnerable to politicization and misuse. We know that's for a fucking fact. Regulation, you know, as a hidden tax. Taxes aren't the only way government extract wealth. Regulations often act as a hidden tax, burdening businesses and individuals in ways that are not immediately apparent, but still costly. You know, in fact, the cost of compliance with government regulations, you know, can run into the billions of dollars annually for some people. Actually, as a whole, it definitely does. Here's a good one. EPA. Waters of the U.S. rule expanded the definition of federally regulated waters to include puddles and ditches. They want to control the puddles outside your home and the ditches along your house. They want all that freaking water. You don't own it. U.S. owns it. Farmers and landlords were forced to spend time and money to comply with these stupid permits and fines, which place additional burdens on small businesses, landowners, while large corporations could afford to hire attorneys, to navigate the regulatory freaking red tape maze bullshit that they put on everybody and find their loopholes. Small businesses in particular spend a significant amount of time and money on legal fees, compliance paperwork, that eats up at their freaking resources and their ability to actually grow. The Regulation Act, it's a stealth tax, it's invisible to most, but just as impactful and direct as direct taxation. It's asinine, people. This is a great one. I love the death tax. This is, again, another stupid bullshit. In 1916, Congress introduced a federal income estate tax, often referred to as the death tax, originally designed to break up wealth held by a small number of powerful families and prevent the creation of vast dynasties. Who the fuck is the government to decide, what families can and can't have in the creations of their own dynasty? That's bullshit. Anyways, so it has been an unintended consequence. I mean, we see it, but it hits family farms, small businesses the hardest. They ain't breaking up the fucking Rockefellers. They ain't breaking up Vanguard. They ain't breaking up fucking BlackRock, are they? If the heirs don't have enough cash on hand to pay the tax, they're forced to sell the land or the business just to cover the damn bill. So the estate tax, targets the property that's already been taxed during the life of the owner, meaning the families face double taxation. It's bullshit. While the owner's alive and once again after death, it's horseshit. Sorry, I'm cussing a lot, but obviously I think a lot of people are too. The taxes in this country are fucked up. As Benjamin Franklin famously said, nothing is certain except death and taxes. So unfortunately for many families, taxes upon death have become a significant financial burden that could result in the loss of even their home or livelihood. So the bottom line so far, property tax means you never truly own your home. Eminent domain abuse allows government to seize land for private developers under the ruse of fucking public benefit. The IRS has become the raping weapon of the nation, that can be wielded for political purpose and target specific groups. Regulation, functions as a hidden tax, increasing the compliance costs for small businesses while, benefiting the well-connected. Even death in America doesn't end the reach of the damn government. As heirs face, burn some estate taxes, it's bullshit. Fighting back, despite the many abuses of power, it is not hopeless. I do believe that. Citizens have fought back many times and won in the past. Here I'm going to try to give you some examples of how ordinary people can fight back against an unfair taxation and government overreach. Proposition 13 in 1978, California voters passed a landmark measure which capped property tax rates and limited how fast assessment could increase. I don't know if that's been changed, but that's what I found. So, but this has saved homeowners from being taxed out of their homes by skyrocketing property values. Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. This is, I don't know how many states have this, but this was a thing called Tabor. In 1992, Colorado voters approved this constitutional amendment, which requires voters' approval for any tax. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Any tax increase and mandates refunds of surplus tax revenue. So this has kept the government growth in check, and it has returned, billions of dollars to taxpayers. You don't get a whole lot, but look at Colorado. Democrats in control. We are in debt, millions of dollars in debt. The other one I was talking about, I'm gonna try to say her name, Gerlandon Tyler. Again, it's a woman, 94-year-old woman, in 2023, in a landmark case. 94-year-old Tyler won a 9-0 decision from the Supreme Court, protecting her property rights against the county's overreach in seizing her condo over unpaid taxes. So these victories show that the direct ballot initiatives, state constitution, and individual lawsuits can make a difference. Additionally, local efforts like recalls of overtaxing school boards or city councils, voting down bonds and levies have proven successful in the past. The power to resist is in our hands. The government only has the power we're willing to give it. Real change happens when citizens, like you and me, stand up, get informed, and actively fight for fair treatment, whether through local elections, advocacy campaigns, or direct legal action. We all have the tools to push back against abusive taxation and government overreach. It's not just about fighting taxes. It's about protecting our damn rights, our homes, and our futures. The question is simple. Will you stand up for your rights, or will you continue paying for a system that is not working for you? I'll be right back.
I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. We bled in the fields, we froze in the snow, no shoes on our feet.
So I'm kind of changing these up just a little bit. Hopefully I didn't cuss too much in the taxation stuff, but it obviously kind of gets to me, like it probably gets to a lot of you. But anyway, so little practical patriot skills for the week. So some real action you can take. Hopefully it helps. So fight property tax. Reach your local tax. Reach out to your local tax assessment. Every year, assessors determine the value of your property, and that value dictates how much you owe. So if you feel your property is overvalued, file an appeal. You can file appeals, with your local assessor's office. Most counties offer an online process, and many people have successfully reduced their property tax bills this way. So, join a local tax protest, in your community, or you can organize the protest yourself, and for any unreasonable property tax increase. These are usually peaceful, not Antifa type protests. It just involves showing up at a local government meeting, where budget and taxes are being discussed. That's how you do it. So the more people that show up, the stronger the message gets across, hopefully. But obviously some of these douchebags, they honestly don't even care what you say, because they're already in office. Get involved in local elections. Support or initiate a local tax reform. So many states and municipalities allow citizens to propose initiatives that can limit property tax or cap spending. Join or start a grassroots campaign to push for tax limitation, transparency, or better management of public funds in your area. Vote for candidates who support tax relief. This doesn't just mean presidential election. Many cities and states have elections on tax policy. So pay attention. You can make a direct impact. Vote for candidates who are committed to fighting for fair tax system. I just say get rid of freaking taxes, but just find somebody who wants to reduce or overhaul the tax burden completely. Fight the eminent domain abuse. Educate your community on eminent domain laws. Many citizens aren't aware that they could lose their home or land through eminent domain. So, even for private freaking projects, so start or join an advocacy group in your area to push for a stronger protection against abuse. You can even create an online petition to bring attention to specific cases of overreach, push for stricter local laws. Many states and local government pass laws, in response to the one I was talking about, the Clio versus New London, to limit the use of eminent domain for private development. But do you have that? So look up what protections exist in your state and advocate for stronger local laws, if protections are weak. Hold government agencies accountable. Request record and transparency. You have the right to know how your taxes are being spent. Even though they try to hide it, but use public record requests, often called the FOIA request, demand transparency from the government agencies, that are spending. The taxation and regulatory enforcement, if something looks shady, rally your community to speak up, monitor regulatory overreach. Government agencies can often pass regulations that function as hidden taxes, especially on small businesses. Stay involved in the public, stay involved in the public comment periods for the proposed regulations. Many agencies allow citizens to voice concerns before no rules are finalized. Engaging with the process can prevent the government, from implementing harmful regulations that hurt our local businesses. Fighting back against the damn death tax. So advocate for estate tax reform. In many cases, the estate tax hits small family businesses or farms the hardest. So we got to write letters to our representatives, or we might have to organize. You might have to organize with local, farm groups to call for an increase in the exemption threshold. I think you should just get rid of it altogether, or a full repeal. Like I'm saying, the estate tax has broad public support for reform, and the continued pressure on lawmakers can make a difference. Get involved. So educate yourself and stay informed. Stay aware of the issues. The first step to fighting back is understanding what's going on. Regularly, read the local national news. I really don't read national news very often. I watch local news, but, keep up, especially about the tax, policies and government spending. Subscribe to some newsletters or organizations that focus on those issues. Like property rights and government transparency. Engage with your community. Hold or attend town hall meetings. You can hold your own meetings. You can call them town halls, whatever you want. Have local forums that discuss taxes, spending, and regulations. These are opportunities to push back and propose increases and offer alternative solutions. Join or support an advocacy organization or group. These support groups are fighting for tax reform. There are numerous national and local organizations like the Tax Foundation, American for Tax Reform, and local taxpayer associations, which lobby for fair tax laws and protection. Join or donate, to organizations that share your values and can lobby on your behalf. Well, there's legal action. If you face government overreach, whether it's taxes, eminent domain, or regulatory issues, consider legal avenues. Don't just bend. Many nonprofit legal defense groups focus on property rights and civil liberties. So you can get a pro bono attorney to help you out. Groups like Institute for Justice and Pacific Legal Foundation can help with legal battles. There's two of them right there for you. So create a coalition for change. Form a coalition. You don't have to fight alone. Join one, with your neighbors, local business owners, and other citizens who are equally concerned about the damn taxes and government overreach. A united front is far stronger in local government and in the media. So use social media to spread the awareness. In today's world, you can reach thousands and even millions of people through social media platforms. Start an online petition, share it. Share the information, organize local protests or awareness, just not Antifa type protests. Draw attention to the unfair tax or government action that you find. There's a lot of ways to fight this stuff, and not the Antifa way. You don't need to go and kill people and destroy the city to get your point across like Antifa and BLM. So, little Tig's tip, some financial preparedness, if I can even talk. So, freedom isn't just political. If the power goes out, the banks are closed, or your cards won't swipe. You're going to need a backup plan. So, here's a little bit of basics. Hard assets. Keep something that is real, like tools, obviously, silver coins, gold coins. You want food, you want water. You know, something of value you can hold. Emergency cash. You know, stash small bills at home. You know, when the grid fails, cash will still work. You know, teach your kids, you know, show them how to save, how to budget, avoid debt. If they don't learn from you, they're going to learn the hard way. You know, I would put between $1,000 to $2,000 in cash somewhere close by in your home. Have cash on hand. Write down what hard assets you already own. Teach a child or your grandchild one money lesson this week. So, little simple stuff that kind of, you know, to keep you prepared. But a patriot with cash on hand and kids who know money isn't controlled. A patriot without it, you're vulnerable. Just think about that. So, end this with the little scripture. Proverbs 13:22. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. But with this death tax, you ain't leaving shit. We need to get rid of this death tax. It's raping. It's making so Americans, honestly, in my opinion, we can't be prosper. We can't insure our kids unless you're filthy rich. You hit it big, you know, like Amazon dude, Facebook dude, Microsoft dude, the Apple dude. I'm not saying their names. Unless you make it big like that, if you're just like middle class, upper class, and you're trying to ensure your kids have something, your family has something, you better ensure you have something to pay those fucking taxes. I know I just said scripture, but again, cussing is not a sin. I really don't care what you say. But anyways, let's pray. So, thank you, Lord, for the blessings you have given us. The works of our hands, the roofs over our heads, and the freedom to provide our families. Give us wisdom to be good stewards, courage to stand against unjust takings, and strength to pass on both faith and freedom to the next generation. In Jesus' name, amen. So this has been the Modern Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, John Tig Tigan. Never let a lie go unchallenged. Never. And always move forward.
This is the ground God has given. This is our ground forged by pain, by the blood of the lost and the weight of the chains. We fight, we build, we don't bow down. This is our soul, this is our sound. Through ash and echo, we carry the flame. This is our ground. Brothers met brothers on opposite lines. The flag torn in half, soaked in rivers of time. From Gettysburg Hills to freedom's last flame, we rose from the ash to